Peggy has asked me to introduce her this evening, so it's certainly a pleasure, and I will do that. Welcome back, Peggy, from Nigeria. We're so happy to have you back, and I know that you have a lot of interesting things to tell us tonight about your experiences there. So I think there's some photo images and some stories and some insights into what's happening in Nigeria right now with Boko Haram and that country that is right now so troubled. But welcome back, Peggy, and so glad we can be here with you tonight.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jonathan, who wrote for me about me in the Athens News. Well, welcome all, and I'm glad you're here. And you are those in my community who've been supporting me over the years to do this kind of work, and so it's always a gift to be able to come back and share with you about what this experience has meant for me, but also what's happening with the people in the areas that I work in. And of course, this time it's Nigeria. And so this is my first time in this kind of capacity there, as far as working to help people who are victims of violence. Because that's really the work that I've been doing in Iraq or in Palestine, working in partnership with local movements for justice and peace in those countries, in those towns. And then this time I was not with Christian Peacemaker Team. I was under the Church of the Brethren, under their disaster crisis relief program. Because the Church of the Brethren in Nigeria, and I'll be showing slides that will lay out the name and everything for you because it's a little complicated. Back in 1922 is when the Church of the Brethren in the United States sent over missionaries and started the mission church in Nigeria. And then in 1973 they became their own church, and independent, but still having some, sister relationships with the church here in the United States. And then when the crisis happened with Boko Haram, the church here decided to send people over and to raise money to help them with dealing with this crisis. And then they decided it would be good to have people there to support them on the ground. And so I was the second volunteer to be able to go there, and I just spent 3 months there. And my friend Cliff Kendi, some of you know, was there before me. And so I was told that my main job was just to have a supportive presence to the people, to listen to their pain, to write their stories, to support the programs they're doing, to let them know that people here care for them and are praying for them. So that was, and then whatever beyond that I find to do, I'm free to do. So I was involved with trauma healing workshops, visited people in the IDP camp, is internally displaced person camp. So I'm going to use that term, and that means people displaced within their own country. Okay, so I'm going to start, and I have lots of slides. Some of them are going to go fast, okay? Just to try to give you a lot of visual about the country, the people, and then on some of them I'll be giving more commentary and sharing the stories that go with those pictures. So I want to mention here that the map of Nigeria too that I'll be pointing to. Okay.
Is that the Atlantic Ocean down here in the lower right?
Yeah, it's probably called Gulf or something. I don't have it there, but it's a Gulf, but it is connected with the Atlantic Ocean. There. Hi, with giving you glimpses of the people in the land of Nigeria. Before you of the place and the beauty of the people. Rural life and city life with its bustling marketplaces. Let me try to get this. This is in the city of Jos, where I was based. And I would walk along the street and enjoy the beauty around me. And I sent some of these pictures home. Many of you have seen these pictures. And a beautiful people, with families, people gracious and hospitable, babies on backs, and laughing children, fun-loving children, beautiful old people, some still with their tribal markings, and beautiful young children, babies. Okay, but since 2009, they have been victims of the violent group, whoops, wait a minute, called Boko Haram. The official name is up here because some people want to know. It's a long name and it means people committed to the propagation of the Prophet's teachings and jihad, and it was started in 2002. Although most of the violent campaigns actually began in 2009. It's when Boko Haram started going into the villages, burning churches, schools, and mostly targeting Christians in their communities, but also targeting Muslim people who would not cooperate with them, who would not join them. But Boko Haram is the nickname for this group. And it's a loose translation of the Hausa, which means Western education is haram, is forbidden or sinful. And Boko really means fake. That's the more literal translation of it. But ever since the British colonization and the takeover of the North in 1903, there were many people in that area who resisted education coming in from the West. So it really has its roots in early colonialization. And there were people in tribes and peoples that refused to send their children to Western schools. So it isn't just a new phenomenon that had its roots there. And of course, then because of racism, colonization, suppression, taking the natural resources and the powerful and the rich people of the country, taking that, putting it in their pockets, the corruption of very little of the resources going in to care for the people, to fix the roads, all of these factors generated a lot of anger over the years that began to foment. And so it's not just a religious thing, it's not just an extremist Muslim thing, but it has its roots also in the social conditions there and in the oppressive society and how the rich took advantage of the resources and of the poor there. There's just a lot that goes into understanding the rise of Boko Haram. But I'm sure you've seen pictures of the fighters. And they even put out their own videos looking very ruthless, and they put out videos of beheading people, things that are not done in all of their encounters, but they do it every so often and make videos in order to create a lot of fear and terror among the people.
They're all men?
As far as I know, I have not heard or seen of any women fighters. I mean, that's different than in Iraq, in northern Iraq, where you have the Kurdish Peshmerga and the Kurdish fighters, where you have a lot of women involved in that. It's different. Okay, now Boko Haram began in Maiduguri, the main city of the Borno state, okay? And then in 2014, the Nigerian military came into Maiduguri and took over their headquarters, and they thought they crushed them at that point. But what happened is they just moved their headquarters over to the Gwosa area, right over here. And that's where there's forests and mountains. In the mountains, there's caves and tunnels. very easy for them to hide out, and many forests. Okay, now most of the attacks have been in this area, the Yobe, Borno, and Adamawa states. These are the three. Even though there have been attacks in other parts of the country, those are the main areas of violence. This picture shows, the dark places show the places where more attacks occurred and more people killed, those areas. One other thing I want to explain about Boko Haram is that this is what the local people shared, is that at first they seemed to be a group that was just rebelling against the government and the police. And so most people did not see them as particularly threatening them, the local people. And so the early attacks were on police stations and government buildings. And then as time went on, they began going into the villages to try to get support of the people. So they would go into the mosques and ask if they could pray there. And then many of the mosques opened up their space for them to pray. And then later they would come in and they would offer money to people to expand their businesses. Of course, these were Muslim people they offered it to. And then once they received money from them, then they were beholden to them. It was much harder later. But they received money not knowing what their real goals were and their real activities were going to be. And so you'd have the majority of Muslims in that area not really supporting these more extremist kinds of goals and extreme violence of theirs, but feeling like they were caught up into it. And of course, many of them later were threatened that if they did not join or cooperate, they would be killed and their families would be killed. So but it reminded me of in the Second World War, where first they came, for the communists, but I wasn't a communist, and so I didn't respond. It was that gradual coming in and trying to build support from the local people, targeting different groups, and then later the more ferocious, horrific nature began to unfold. That is, after 2009 is the date in which they declared that they were going to start a caliphate, an Islamic state. Okay, another thing that got the attention of the rest of the world was in April of 2014, when the girls from the Chibok school were kidnapped. 276 teenage girls were abducted from their boarding school. And this is a photo put out by Boko Haram because they want it to look as horrible as possible for these girls. I mean, that's part of their propaganda. Not that it isn't horrible, but I mean, they always try to put the worst face on what they show. And then here's some more pictures to make more, more real and human. I like these pictures that show them to be girls, just like our girls here. And of course, this caused a lot of grief for the families. Mother with the suitcase with the clothes from her daughter, still hoping that she'll return. And these these following pictures are things that I personally saw of the churches being burnt, that were burnt. This is around the city of Mubi. And homes and villages kind of burnt and ravished. Clinic from the EYN, the Church of the Brethren there, completely destroyed. And so in October of 2014, that's last October, Boko Haram attacked the headquarters for the Brethren, the Nigerian Brethren, and there's a mass exodus in the city of Mubi. The city of Mubi is over here in northern Adamawa, right here. And so people, and a lot of people, did not have time to grab bags to carry. This is one where they had more notice, but a lot of time they just rushed out with whatever they had on their back and didn't carry things. And families were separated. You know, someone was at work, and so they fled from there. And one fled into Cameroon, and the others would flee to the southern Nigeria. And so families were separated, and there's still families that don't know where parts of their families are. And so this created a real humanitarian crisis where you had, you know, tens of thousands of people with no home and with nothing to eat and just wandering, and then many of them just kept going to other villages south, but many of them ended up in the city of Yola, which is, where am I finding it here? Here it is, right here. And which is an area that Boko Haram has never attacked, and so they consider it fairly safe. And so we visited a lot of displacement camps there. And of course, children would always gravitate to us and come up and want a lot of attention. Some of these were on the grounds of churches, some were in schools or empty buildings. This is one that the people were from a very traditional rural area, and so when they came, they were given an area right outside of the city, and they just built their own homes just like they had back in their villages. Okay, so this is what it has meant for Ecclesiar Yanua on Nigeria. That's the EYN. That's the brethren, Nigerian brethren. Okay, over 16,000 killed, 600,000 unaccounted for, that they don't know where they are, whether they're killed or not. And some of these could be in other countries as refugees, but they don't know where they are. Over 700,000 internally displaced, 70% of their members. The Chibok girls, 178, were from EYN. About 15,000 refugees in camps in Cameroon, and then 1,674 of their church buildings destroyed. Educational, medical institutions destroyed or closed up indefinitely. So it was a big crisis because they were the main church group in that area where Boko Haram, and so they just have much more casualties and problems that resulted from that. Okay, but I'm going to use that term EYN a lot, so that's the name of the people that I was living among and assisting during this time. Okay, I want to shift a little and just start telling some stories. This is Musa, and the first time that Boko Haram came to his village, the town of Gish, that's right on the edge, right near Cameroon. It's right up in here, right near Gwoza. Boko Haram started to kill a number of people, but it wasn't the massive killing yet. They looted, took belongings, took people's cars, and Musa and other people fled into the bush. Now when I say bush, that's sort of the the untamed growth of bushes and trees, and it's just an area that you could go in and hide, and you could sometimes find edible foods. And a lot of people just lived there in the bush. Okay, 5 months, then they would come back once Boko Haram left. The second time, 5 months later, in April of 2014, Boko Haram came back. And even though his wife had just recently given birth, they decided they better run. It was during a time of 6 hours of constant shooting, gunfights in their town. So he grabbed their young baby, put it to his chest, bent down, and they ran through and left the village even though there were gun battles all around them. And they went south. They went to other villages, and then when Boko Haram came close to them there, they kept going south to Yola. So I use this as a typical story. This is the most common scenario of what happened to people. Some people went up into the mountains, and then even into Cameroon, and some people are still there, have been up in the mountains for a year or over a year, just living in the wild. And sometimes, if they know Boko Haram is not around, they'll come down to the villages to get supplies, and they'll go back up for safety into the mountains. Some people didn't know for a year that their father or mother had died. I mean, this is the kind of thing that they're experiencing. Okay, now Naomi was one of those that was fleeing from Mubi in last October. She was with her baby and her daughter, and her husband was with her 3 sons. They were separated. And so she didn't know until she had already left, and her husband didn't show up. She found out that her husband had been shot, and as well as the 3 boys. Okay, Boko Haram fighters came to Monica's home in the middle of the night. And they beheaded her husband. She witnessed theirs. They were sleeping. And then they approached her. And she quickly put up her arm, and they slashed her arm and then also cut her throat and left her for dead. But she didn't die. And her neighbor found her and took her to the hospital. And she has scars on her neck where she's had multiple operations, and on her arm. And 2 of her 3 boys had their throats slit in the middle of the night. So these are some of the most tragic, some of the more horrific stories that I heard from people. Okay? Now there were others like Rikafti, who were captured by Boko Haram. She's about 24. She has 2 young children, a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old. She and her husband were fleeing when Boko Haram came, and they came after them. Of course, they were with other people as well. They weren't alone. And then Boko Haram started capturing the women and older girls, and then took them to a camp where they were in a house with guards and locked doors. They were forced to work, but she said they were not physically harmed. They were threatened that if they didn't convert to Islam, they would be slaughtered like cattle, is what they were told. Now, none of them ended up converting, but they didn't know what was going to happen. And so 3 weeks later, she and 15 other women decided that they were going to escape, and they found the guard was asleep and not attentive. And so she strapped her 1-year-old baby onto her back and put the 4-year-old over the wall, climbed over the wall, and the others climbed over and escaped, and then the rest of the night and the next day walked to Cameroon. And there she was able to reconnect with her husband, who was already there. And then from there they went back into Nigeria and down to Yola. And then from there to an IDP camp in, here we are, Jos. This is the Plateau State, and where I was based was right over here in Jos, sort of central Nigeria. Okay. Okay, another woman from the same village during the same raid, but they hadn't known each other until now. A woman in her 60s who was also grabbed by Boko Haram fighters, she and some other older women. And as the fighters were walking them out of the village, she heard them say, one of them say to the other, "Shall we kill them here, or shall we wait till we get out of the village?" And then when one of the fighters shot the other woman, she decided she better run. So she ran, but they shot her in the arm. She fell down, but then she lay still. Even though she was not dead, it was a very surface wound. It went in, she showed us the scar, but it went in here and came out, it actually went in the back, came out the front there, and was not lodged in her arm. So once they were gone, she was able to get up and follow other people back up into the mountains. And there, somebody, that night, a neighbor went over into Cameroon and got medicine for her. And then 3 days later, she and others went into Cameroon. And she also ended up in an IDP camp there in the Plateau State. Okay, all right. Some risked their lives to save other people. So I heard a number of stories. I'll just highlight one. This man, and you'll see him later in my presentation in the trauma healing part, but he had several encounters actually with Boko Haram where they almost captured him and he got away. But the story I want to tell you is that during the time Boko Haram was active in their village, and it was dangerous to be out, and they would, every so often you would find somebody killed along the road. A neighbor woman, about 8 months pregnant, the baby died within her womb, and she was bleeding and in serious medical condition. And nobody wanted to take the risk of taking her to the hospital, but he volunteered. And he put her in his car. The closest hospital is in Cameroon from where they were, and he went over and took her to the hospital. When he was coming back, he was stopped by Boko Haram fighters right near the border. And of course he explained what he was doing, that he had to go back home and get more money so that this woman could have surgery that would save her life. And they decided to let him go with the idea that they would find him on the way and get that money. And so, of course, he guessed that that was the reason they let him go. And so when he decided, he knew that the doctor was going to go ahead and do the surgery, but just going to wait till he got back with the money to release his identity card and all that he had to leave there. So he waited another day, and then he went a different route and crossed into Cameroon so he could avoid Boko Haram, and he did. And he was able then to bring the woman back when she was, healed and actually saved her life during that time. And for me, inspiring, there are many inspiring things, but one of them was the way people open their heart to each other. Even though it may put them in more danger or their family in more danger, they reached out to help others who needed help. Not necessarily just thinking of themselves. And there were many others that helped in various ways with people who were victims. For example, Becky and Paul Gatsama, they were living in Jos at the time and were not personally threatened or hurt in this, but they took in 29 of the Chibok girls that were able to escape right at the beginning of their capture. And they came and stayed with them for safety there in their home in Jos. And they found resources to help the families of the girls to kind of resettle there. So physical support as well as spiritual and emotional support for healing of the trauma that they were going through. And so they lived with them, and then they helped 10 of the girls to come to the United States to live with families here and to go to private schools. And they are placed who are, are still there, and they're not quite sure what they're going to do. And then here's at the conference I was at a week ago, where 10 of the girls that are placed here were there, and here's one of them who is talking to Becky and to somebody else, but just to give you an idea of what's happening with many of the girls. Okay, others reached out and opened their homes to people who now were suddenly homeless. And this is Janata Gamachi and her little boy. And about a year ago, they began taking in people who were displaced. And they currently have 53 people living in their household, 11 children besides their own. And I had this talk with her, and she told me, she said, of course, it makes life a lot harder for me. And she went on to explain the extra work because they cook a lot. Well, back up. The women and young children sleep on the living room floor, okay? The older children sleep in the backyard. And the men and older boys sleep out around the area under trees and under shelters, whatever, because they can't stay. And then the cooking is done together on large pots over stones and with wood fire. And of course, everyone who is there helps with the work and helps with their chickens and helps gather the eggs and does the work for the family and for the household. And I asked her about it, and she said, yes, this is what our Nigerian culture and tradition teach us to do, that we are to take care of each other. This is also what my faith demands of me, to take care of each other, my brothers and sisters who are in need, and to sacrifice for them in the situation. Okay. There were several NGOs that were reaching out and helping the victims of Boko Haram. And this is a group of women and men, young men who are stirring up a big vat of shampoo, homemade shampoo. And they make other products that they can then bottle and sell. And it is part of a program to give them skills for employment, to help them start their own businesses. And all of the 10 people that are in this program, young men and women, they were either their husband had been killed by Boko Haram or their parents had been killed, and they are the sole breadwinners for their family, these young adults. And so they are learning to sew on sewing machines and make garments that they can sell, or they learn to use a knitting machine and make hats and socks that they can sell. And at the end of the 6-month training time, they can choose a knitting machine or a sewing machine that they can take and then start their own business. Now, the same organization, which is called the Center for Caring, Employment, and Peace Initiatives, CEPI, and the director of this is a EYN woman. Her husband is the president of EYN. She's a very strong woman, Rebecca Dolly, and you'll see her picture later on. But she runs this NGO, and one of the things they do is give out food and supply distribution to people displaced. And so here people are unloading. And these are, well, Americans and Europeans that are volunteers over there. These are not Nigerians that are doing this, but a lot of Nigerians are part of their organization. And I was a part of this food distribution day there in Jos. And up here the women are lining up, and their names are on a list and they are checked off. I mean, it's very orderly. But then there are people that are not on these lists, or people that don't belong to the Church of the Brethren there. And they are also, as long as there are supplies, they are also given supplies. That's one of the things I appreciated about the church there, is that they were not just caring just for their own, but they were reaching out and giving aid to all people, you know, who, as long as they had the resources to do that. Okay, so they're being given bags of rice or bags of cracked corn or millet. And here I'm giving out buckets to people. And there's big pots, like cooking pots, that we're giving families. And here's Rebecca Dolly, who is giving bags of cooking oil. And these are the women, and here at the end of the time, to carry your supplies back with you, the best way is on your head, which is the way people carry bundles and loads there. But even though, you know, they are getting these supplies, and they can get it like either every 3 weeks or once a month, depending on the particular system, those supplies keep them alive, you know, but it's not, you know, it doesn't give them a real varied diet. And it doesn't really satisfy all their needs. It's just more subsistence. And so, of course, wherever they can, they are trying to get employment, and they're trying to earn money. But because of so many displaced people, jobs are extremely hard to find. Okay, another organization called Sisters, women who were helping other women with programs for women, but also they started a special school in the Joss area for displaced children. And 60 of the 120 children they have there are orphans. The parents were killed by Boko Haram in the attacks. Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit again. So, what about the general response? Here I'm showing all the different outpourings of love and care, all right? But what about the general response of this group of people to this violent group, okay? In many other situations in Nigeria, and there have been many other times in their past where there have been battles between Muslims and Christians, and tensions where both sides would fight each other, okay? But here you have a church group that it comes from an Anabaptist tradition, and are pacifists, and they don't believe in fighting. They believe in nonviolence. They believe in reconciliation and forgiveness. And so they are not responding the way many other groups would respond to a very horrendous group like Boko Haram. So what does a group like this do? When their leaders are hunted down, their church buildings, their homes are destroyed, businesses are burned, and they're displaced, okay? But they take their faith and their teachings very seriously. Okay? So the initial response, of course, was one to escape. Obviously, you escape groups of people that are coming in to kill you, right? Their general response was one of non-retaliation. Now, in any situation like this, where you have 1 million people in the Nigerian Church of the Brethren, it's a very large church there. And, you know, there are going to be members that do not follow the church's teaching, and that's true. There were those who did fight back to defend themselves. And there were those who did convert out of extreme pressure. And these were very few. It wasn't the majority of the people. You know, there were people that, because of the church's stance on nonviolence, they left the church because they wanted to join the militia, whatever. So there's, you know, never 100%, but the basic response was one of nonviolence. One of the ways that their church leaders decided to help them, once they were terrified, once they were traumatized, and many of them wanted to go back to their villages, but then they would have to face their neighbors who were complicit with Boko Haram. How are they going to deal with that? There's all these issues that were coming up for them. So what do? So they started a trauma healing program. Now, this was to help those traumatized to find positive ways to deal with the terror, the anger, the negative emotions, the fear, that they were carrying because of what they had gone through. And this is done with the understanding that if all of this inside of them is not recognized, is not acknowledged, and not dealt with positively, that it is going to really hurt that person and lead to consequences for their family, for their community, for their nation, and likely to continue the cycles of violence in their society. So this was a way to try to find healing and to try to find a way of bringing people through this. Okay. So they did many things in these workshops. For example, here they are sharing one-to-one with others in the workshop, and they're encouraged to really share openly the feelings and all that they were left with, and listen to each other and learn to listen and encourage other people to share. And then they do many activities for small group sharing, trust building activities, and then they have a lot of time spent on, now what do I do with this when I go back? And one of the things inspiring for me was their desire to forgive and their desire to work for reconciliation. And that's not an easy thing to do. And the people here, they did not encourage them to just stuff all those feelings down so that they could push forgiveness. It was not something like that, but something that was would come in the process of dealing with the trauma. It was a process that they were working toward. But they took it very seriously and they helped each other. And so here's Elizabeth Solomon, whose husband and 3 children were separated from her, and she has still not found them. And so she presumes that they're dead. And so she shared her anguish about this. But then she said, but I want to forgive. And so others there were also sharing their struggles and struggling together to come to that. Here's Ibrahim Dowda that I had shown before. He's the one that helped the pregnant woman. You know, he said, I know the people who stole my cows, goats, generator, motorcycle, and everything in my house. When I came to my first trauma healing workshop, I was bitter and not ready to forgive Boko Haram for the way it destroyed my life and my community. I believe that justice should be done before I could even consider forgiveness. Now, this is his second training, he said, now I can forgive. I even called up several of these people that have taken my things, and I told them that I forgive them. And they were shocked. And some of them even thanked me. He even went that far to take the first step. And then he said, when I go back, I want to meet with them and talk with them about it and try to come for reconciliation. And it was amazing. The spirit, the dedication for working. And they understood that forgiveness was a part of the healing, that it would help free them up and of the weights that they were carrying. And many of them walked out of these healing sessions saying, my blood pressure went down, it was real high, and I had all these illnesses and these symptoms, and now I'm at peace. So it really was making a difference in their lives and in what they were experiencing. Okay, one more woman here, Hanatu. And she was a pastor's wife. And so one day when she was in her village, she saw a Muslim neighbor coming toward her house with a knife. And he asked about her husband. And he was looking for the husband to kill. And the husband wasn't home, fortunately. But she, of course, then ran away. And she was carrying this hostility and this anger, and now here she is working through this and trying to come for forgiveness. And then many of them said, it's really by the grace of God that we can forgive. And that's their faith. Well, by the end of our trauma healing workshops, we had a really beautiful exercise in which we grabbed the thumb of the person next to us, and we had this whole circle of hands. And you could probably tell which one is mine. But I just felt very graced, very such a gift to be among people who were grappling with real issues and really supporting each other through this. And so this was symbolic of how important it was for them to support each other, how important it was for them to be part of a healing community that would help people walk through this, and that they weren't alone and left alone in it. Okay, let's see, where are we? Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about Muslim-Christian relationships, because another piece of the work that the Nigerian brethren were doing, they were involved with organizations and groups that were Christians and Muslims coming together to work together to dispel a lot of the hostility and a lot of the tensions in their society, try to work for reconciliation, try to work for respect and trust among their people. And so, because when I talked with some of the brethren, Nigerian brethren, I heard all different points of view. When I was there at one of the sites of a burnt church near Mubi, a woman there whose husband had been killed as they were fleeing, she said, now I don't think I could ever live with Muslims again. They will never change. And there were those who still carried so much grief and trauma and could not move beyond that. And they couldn't even see the possibility of any reconciliation. And then on the other end, there were people working for interfaith respect and trust. And so you had all different points of view depending on what their experience was and where they are in their healing work. This man, he was a church leader who told about in his village, he said, when Boko Haram came into my village, he said to me, we had been living in peacefully before that happened. And now all of a sudden, there were the hostility and mistrust. But he said, my Muslim neighbors and friends protected me and helped me to escape. So I heard story after story of how Muslims and Christians worked together to help each other during the crisis. And I found that very encouraging. that they refuse to let, to fall into the demonizing of other people, refuse to put people in the enemy category just because they were from a different faith. And I found that very encouraging. And here's another man, Toma, who was the peace coordinator for the EYN church and had started peace clubs in some of the high schools in Adamawa state. And he has been working now for about 10 years on issues of interfaith work. And this man, James Musa, another church leader who shared how important it was for them when they gave aid. He said to give it to everyone and not just to our own, not just to give it to Christians. And so it was very important for him to try to bridge those divides. He said those who are displaced that are Muslim, they're experiencing the same kind of pain. Why are we, we must also help everyone who is in need. And back to Toma. I wanted to, I think I already said that. Okay. Then this is a man that I saw just doing a lot of very inspiring things. He, in 2013 and 14, when the attacks really intensified against Christians, he was living in Jos, but he traveled into the Northeast, talking with Christians and Muslims, trying to reach out to help them. And over those last two and a half years, he's been giving money to people from different backgrounds to help them get resettled into another area, or giving them encouragement, finding ways for them to make a new life. Now, he's the husband of Janata that I showed, that they have 53 people. And at first, it was Muslims and Christians, I didn't mention that, in their household, helping out everyone who had escaped. He is director of an organization called, let me get this here, Lifeline Compassionate Global Initiatives. And it's a group of Muslims and Christians that are doing projects together. And one of their projects is the Gurku Interfaith IDP camp, just north of Abuja. Abuja is the capital and it's over here, capital of Nigeria. And so we have 63 families, Christian and Muslim, that moved into the Gurku IDP camp in May. Now, I went there in late March, and so I saw it before it was finished. And here, Muslims and Christian people that were going to move in, they were living in the nearby village, preparing, and they all helped build the village. They made homemade bricks out of the clay there and put them in the sun to dry, and they helped to build the walls and the roofs. And women, when we were there, the women came around, came around to meet us. But they see this as a model for unity, a model that they hope will be picked up and carried out in other locations of bringing people together in friendship and harmony to live peacefully together. And here the men are working on the roof, and here are the finished buildings. And these are very simple, little 3-room dirt floor, not fancy, and then they have a latrine between 2 of the houses so that 2 families share a latrine and a little kitchen, outdoor kitchen area. And they have a hand a pump that they go to get their water, and they're each given a plot of land, each family, a plot of land to do some basic farming to get some food for their families. And then they're starting now to build a school and a medical clinic that will be available to other people in the area as well as their village. And before they moved in, we did a trauma healing workshop there, where Muslims and Christians sat around together and also shared and went through some of the healing process together. And they found that, you know, very strengthening for their group. Okay, I'm aware of the time, but then there were Nigerians who reached out and responded in love and to help people who had been Boko Haram fighters. And so I want to just share briefly a couple of those stories. This is Amadou Bello. He is a EYN pastor. And he was a pastor in Maiduguri. That's where Boko Haram started. And in 2009, that's where they started the violence. And against Christians, they start burning churches. And he told me that while he was there those years, most of the violence would be done at night, and then during the day they would go out and collect bodies, sometimes with severed limbs, and they would try to give that person a proper burial. And they would put ladders up on two sides of their house so that depending on which direction Boko Haram came in the middle of the night, they could flee out the other way. Things like that. But he was a pastor there in this real large church for 4 years and just experienced a lot of horrible things. Well, he told me that during those 4 years, 4 different times, small groups of Boko Haram fighters came into his church and they wanted to see the pastor. And he didn't know if they were coming in there to kill him or if they were just testing him out, whatever. But they sat, he invited them in, they sat down and talked, and he listened to them and their problems. And before they left, he prayed with them. And then instead of having them go out the front door where they would have been caught by Nigerian soldiers and then killed immediately, he had them escorted out a back way so that they would not be grabbed. And he said, "I do this because I love you." And he's an amazing attitude person. And then one day he was, people have other people wash their cars quite frequently. Anyway, but he had this man who always washed his car. And he was talking to him and he said, "If I were in political position, I wouldn't kill the Boko Haram fighters immediately. If they're captured, I would have them brought to me, I would listen to them and hear their stories and their complaints, and I would find out what they're angry and upset about. And then if possible, I would try to do something about those conditions." And this is amazing attitude, okay? And so he was telling this man, and then later he found out that this man he was talking to was a Boko Haram commander in secret. And then a few months later, he and his family were traveling in their car and were stopped at a Boko Haram checkpoint, and just their car was surrounded by fighters. And immediately he just knew that that was the end for him and his family. But one of the fighters looked in the window and recognized him and said, "This is a good man." And then a few months later, he and his family were traveling in their car and were stopped at a Boko Haram checkpoint, and just their car was surrounded by fighters. And immediately he just knew that that was the end for him and his family. But one of the fighters looked in the window and recognized him and said, "This is a good man." And then he said, "You can pass." And he went on his way.